Franklin Moore, 79, pushed open the creaky wooden door of the roadside diner off Highway 17 with a callous hand. The door let out its usual groan, as if it, too, had aged alongside the years. No one looked up, no heads turned. He walked in quietly, like a breeze slipping past an early gray morning. He had come here every Sunday morning for the last 15 years, ever since his wife passed. Same table by the window, same black coffee, no sugar, same plain omelet with no onions. But today, something felt different. The sky outside was thick with clouds, casting a pale gloom through the window pane. Fine mist clung to the glass, blurring the highway beyond. Franklin wore his old Navy uniform, the one that had long faded from deep blue to a weary gray. He still ironed it each week carefully, as if preparing for inspection. On his chest sat a small silver pin engraved with 7 names. His fallen brothers, who never made a home from Da Nang, 1969. 7 men who had once laughed after firefights, made promises to come back together. Now, they lived only in his memory and in that cold piece of metal. A young waitress approached. She had kind eyes and golden hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She smiled warmly, just as she always did. "Same as usual, Mr. Moore." He nodded, silent. Her voice reminded him of his daughter. If she were still alive, she'd be about the same age. He sat down and looked out the window. The wet road reflected streaks of passing headlights. Life outside moved fast. Too fast. People spoke louder now, listened less, rushed more. And memories had no place in this new world. No one asked him about his pen. No one noticed how he leaned slightly to the left when he sat. A reminder the shrapnel still lodged near his spine since 1970. They called him the quiet old vet, the Sunday regular. But no one knew he had once commanded a naval unit, had once held his friend's lifeless body waiting for a medevac that came too late. That every night, he lit a candle in his kitchen for those who never got to grow old. The diner smelled of burnt coffee grounds and grease. The ceiling fan hummed softly above. In the far corner, another older man read the newspaper through thick glasses. Franklin, as always, became just another still figure in the faded painting of this place. Like an old photograph on the wall, sun-faded and long ignored. A little boy dashed past his table and nearly bumped into him. His mother yanked him back, didn't even offer a word. Franklin only smiled faintly. The world didn't slow down anymore. No one had time for old stories. The ones who used to ask, most were gone. The rest lived scattered lives. Quiet like him, the waitress returned and gently placed a plate of eggs and cup coffee in front of him. She set them down as if afraid she might startle him. He looked down at the plate. Beside it, someone had folded a napkin in half. Written in blue ink, in a soft, slanted hand, were 5 simple words. "Thank you for your service." His heart caught. No signature, no name, just the words. It had been years since someone remembered, not him, but them, the names on his chest, the ones he still talked to every night, even though they couldn't answer. A single drop of coffee had spilled near the edge of his plate. Franklin wiped it away slowly, not out of habit, but out of reverence. This table, this place, it was the last of order he had. The only space where things still made sense. Outside, the rain picked up. The wind began to blow harder. But inside him, something shifted. Something small, quiet, like a ripple in still water. As if the past, long buried but never gone, was slowly returning to him. Not in grief this time, but through the gentle kindness of a napkin, a smile, a familiar greeting. Franklin didn't know it yet, but in just a few minutes, when that waitress rolled up her sleeve to show him something small and deeply personal, his entire world would change. Franklin Moore had once served as a naval officer in the United States Navy. In 1969, he was deployed to Da Nang, Vietnam, one of the most dangerous and volatile combat zones at the time. He was 33 years old then. His eyes were still bright, his back still straight, and his heart still full of belief. But in the span of a single night, everything he thought he knew about war, about duty, about courage, about brotherhood, was put to the ultimate test. It was a supply run along the coast. That's all it was supposed to be, until the ambush. Shells exploded from the tree line, tearing through the dawn. The sand was flung into the air, mingling with the smoke, the screams, and the iron scent of blood. By the time the last shot faded into silence, Franklin stood alone, dazed and wounded, his uniform soaked in sweat, dirt, and the lives of 7 men who would never go home. 7 names, 7 brothers, 7 promises unfulfilled. From that day forward, Franklin lived like a man indebted to the fallen. He returned to the States with a body less broken than most, but a soul far heavier. He didn't speak much about the war, not because he had forgotten. No, the memories were too sharp, too vivid. He stayed silent because the pain had no language, because those who hadn't been there could never really understand. In the years that followed, Franklin watched his country move on. The 1970s came and went. The war faded from the headlines, from conversations, from school books. Memorial Day became more about barbecues than memory. The American flag slowly turned into decoration, something you saw in commercials more than you saw in hearts. He noticed the difference. At the supermarket, at church, in the way people averted their eyes when they saw the old man with the limp wearing a faded Navy cap. They called him the quiet vet. They nodded politely, but they didn't ask. Every year on Memorial Day, he would visit the National Cemetery. Alone, he held a small flag in his hand and stood still through the bugle's final note. But around him, people hurried through the day. Stores had discount sales. Chains offered free burgers. Pop songs blared through loudspeakers, while Franklin whispered names only he remembered. Sometimes, early in the morning, he would open the small wooden box in his bedroom. Inside were a few yellowed photos, a handful of handwritten letters, a tarnished unit badge, and the silver memorial pin etched with the names of the 7 fallen. He would place his hand on it, close his eyes, and say each name aloud, not out of habit, but to keep them alive, to keep them from disappearing. He had married, once, had a daughter, but the war took from him more than time. It took the part of him that should have been present for them. He startled in his sleep. He drifted in silence. His wife once held his hand and asked, "Are you still here with me?" And he couldn't answer, because a part of him still walked the beaches of Da Nang every night. After his wife died, Franklin started coming to the little roadside diner every Sunday morning, not because the food was special, but because it was quiet. It didn't ask questions. The corner table by the window became his retreat, a cup of hot coffee, a view of the wet asphalt, and the comfort of being forgotten. He never told anyone about the 7, not the waitress, not his neighbor, not the minister at his small-town church. The memory of his brothers lived in his heart, not for show, but as a solemn, private vow. But that kind of memory is lonely. It wears down a man. It makes him feel like the last living piece of story no one else is reading. Until that day, it was a rainy Sunday. The sky was low and gray. The diner was half empty. The young waitress brought as usual, coffee, eggs, no onions. But this time, she didn't just leave the plate and walk away. She sat down across from him. She looked at him not with pity, but with gratitude. And then she slowly rolled up the sleeve of her left arm. There on her skin was a small, clean tattoo. It read, MIA/Kia, Da Nang 69. And beneath it were 7 names. 7 names he had never said aloud to anyone. In that moment, Franklin knew he wasn't the last to remember. It wasn't a headline. It wasn't carved in marble. It was inked into the skin of a young woman, a waitress who had never seen a battlefield, but had chosen to carry the legacy of men she never met. And for the first time in decades, Franklin felt something lift. The silence broke, not with words, but with remembrance, not with noise, but with meaning. Franklin sat at his usual corner table by the window, his thin, weather hands wrapped around an old ceramic mug. The black coffee inside had already cooled halfway, but he hadn't taken a sip. Steam still drifted upward in gentle swirls, like the slow, measured breath of man too familiar with long silences. The young waitress returned with his eggs and 2 slices of toast, their edges slightly charred. But instead of setting the plate down and walking away, she hesitated. Something small, something unspoken made her linger. She didn't say a word at first. She just stood there, her expression softer than usual, something between sorrow and gratitude. Then she quietly pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. That alone startled Franklin. In all his years at this diner, not a single staff member had ever joined him at the table. She sat upright, hands folded in her lap, and said gently, "Mr. Moore, I've been meaning to show you something." Her voice was soft, like the wind drifting across a deserted shoreline. Not loud, but piercing in its stillness. Franklin looked up, his tired eyes fixed on hers. He didn't speak, but the look he gave her said everything. "Go ahead." She slowly raised her left arm and began rolling up her sleeve. Her movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, like she was opening an old chest filled with things long buried but never forgotten. Beneath the cuff was her forearm, pale, slender, and unmistakably young. But etched into her skin was a small, clean tattoo. No flourishes, no decoration. Just cold, clear lines. MIA/Kia, the Nong 69. And beneath that, 7 names. The font was plain, unadorned, like something carved into a gravestone. 7 names. Franklin's hands began to tremble. His heart pounded, as if trying to leap from his chest. He knew those names. Not just the way you know old friends. He had carried those names, held their bodies, heard their last words, felt their blood on his hands. These weren't just names. These were his brothers, the ones who never made it home, the ones who died beside him on the sand while the world kept turning. He looked up at her again, voice barely a whisper. I never told anyone those names." She nodded, a faint, bittersweet smile forming on her lips. "I know," she said. "You didn't have to." For a long moment, they just sat there in silence. Then she spoke again. "My grandfather, his name was Raymond Carter. He served with you. He was a radio man." Franklin closed his eyes. Ray Carter, the kid with the radio always slung over his shoulder, the one who hummed songs in the rain, the last one to speak before the sky tore open. "We've got incoming, Skipper." She continued, slowly, reverently. "He was the only one who made it back with you that day. When he passed 2 years ago, I found an old shoebox in his closet. Letters, maps, a list of names, and a note." She paused, collecting herself. The note said, "If you ever meet Franklin Moore, tell him he carried us all." Franklin inhaled sharply, but the air felt too thick. His vision blurred, and for the first time in over 30 years, he let the tears fall, not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of not being alone anymore. She pointed gently to her tattoo. "I had this done the day of Grandpa's funeral," she said. "I wanted something permanent, something that doesn't fade." Then her voice dropped, just above a whisper. "He once told me, the dead die twice, once on the battlefield, and once again when the world forgets their names." I didn't want that to happen. Franklin couldn't respond. He didn't have to. In that moment, every crack inside him, every quiet fracture caused by decades of silence, was mended by something he never expected to find in a roadside diner. Remembrance. This young woman, who had never seen a battlefield, never heard a shot fired, was carrying the memory of men she never met. Not for glory, not for show, but out of quiet, sacred duty. She didn't say anything else. She just rolled her sleeve back down, stood up, and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. A firm, warm touch, not out of pity, but respect. A silent salute. Franklin sat still, his hands resting his lap, his eyes still moist. But inside, something stirred. Not the past, not grief, but something he thought had long died in him. The feeling of being remembered. From that morning forward, Franklin Moore no longer ate alone. Every Sunday, Emily, the young waitress with a tattooed memory of war, still brought him as usual, 2 eggs, no onions, and a hot black coffee. But now, she no longer rushed away. She sat with him, holding her own cup, listening quietly to stories Franklin hadn't shared with another soul in decades. She asked about each of the 7 men, and he told her, slowly, sometimes pausing for long stretches as if to hear their laughter one more time in his mind. She never pushed. She simply sat with a patience rare for someone her age, especially when it came to someone else's pain. Each year, on June 19th, the day his 7 brothers fell into Nong, Emily began hosting a quiet remembrance at the diner. No loudspeakers, no flags, just a small bouquet of fresh flowers placed gently on the empty table by the window. A modest sign above it read, "Reserved for the ones who never came home." A few regulars took notice, then others. Some paused, nodded in silence as they passed. The story began to spread, not through speeches or headlines, but through quiet respect. Franklin still wore the silver badge with the 7 names pinned neatly to his chest. But now, he wasn't the only one carrying them. They lived on in Emily's tattoo, in her memory, in the silent gestures of strangers who had never met those men, but now honored their legacy in their own quiet ways. One gray afternoon, as rain traced soft trails down the diner window, Franklin lingered a little longer than usual. He looked outside, then turned to Emily and said, almost in a whisper, "I used to think there'd come a day when I'd be the last one who remembered them, but now I know I was wrong." Emily didn't respond with words. She just smiled, gently, knowingly, and Franklin understood. Some promises don't need to be spoken, and some memories, when passed on with love, never truly fade. If you believe that fallen soldiers should never be forgotten, hit like, subscribe, and share this story, because memory is the only way they live on in our hearts. United States. This is Old Soldier Story.